Students, colleagues, and guests, welcome to the first lecture in the Common Core Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Wed Edwards, I'm the Director of the Common Core Curriculum, and it gives me great pleasure to invite Professor Amy Choi, Pro Vice Chancellor for Teaching and Learning and Vice President, to come and say a few words as a way of introduction to this series.
Welcome students, colleagues, and guests, and of course our speaker here as well. This year is an auspicious year for Hong Kong University. We have admitted a double cohort of very, very bright students, and many of them are in the audience. We have opened a new campus, and students are raving about the learning commons. And I hope you agree with me. If you agree, please nod your head. And of course, we also have a whole new floor on the third floor of the library, which I would like to call it the Library Commons. And I'm sure the librarian, if he's here, he would like to call it the Library Commons as well. Most important of all, we have launched a new undergraduate curriculum. And this is the third year that we have offered the Common Core courses. But this is the first year where we have the full menu of 140 Common Core courses on offer for students. I don't know if students have ever asked why it's called the Common Core. If you've been to the orientations, you will know why, and I'm sure Gwen have repeated that many, many, many times. But at the risk of repeating messages that you're already familiar with, I'd like to again explain why it is called the Common Core. The word common actually denotes the fact that these courses deal with issues which are common to all human societies, and they are issues of fundamental importance to humankind. It is called common because it offers a common learning experience for all our students, no matter which faculty they're in and no matter what programs they are enrolled in. So for the science students, don't complain that you have to do science courses in the science AOI. And art students, do not complain that you have to do courses in the humanities AOI. And I'm sure after the lecture today, you will understand why we make it compulsory for our students. It is called core because it is we hope that through taking these courses, our students will uphold the core values of a democratic society. These courses also help you to develop the core intellectual skills. The development and the design of the Common Core curriculum has taken 5 years for this university to complete. And I want to thank the director of the Common Core, Mr. Wed Edwards, and also members of the Common Core Committee for working tirelessly with me in the past 5 years in putting this curriculum together. It's also taken teachers hundreds of hours in designing, preparing, and also teaching and revising the courses on the basis of student feedback. This year, we have over 200 teachers involved in teaching these courses and over 110 tutors involved in doing the tutorials. The Common Core curriculum, and our donor, Alex, was telling me just now that a lot of alumni are aware of that, and they have been giving us a lot of support. So I really want to thank them all, and in particular, I want to thank Mr. Alex Lai, who is our alumni, a graduate of the engineering faculty, and that's Alex over there. who is a graduate of the engineering faculty in 1985 for his generous donation, without which it would not have been possible for us to mount this distinguished lecture series. Last but not least, I would like to thank Professor Sandra Gilman for coming all the way, 18 hours of flight, coming to Hong Kong University. He arrived on Sunday. It's probably not as easy to get over a 12-hour difference. So Professor Gilman is no stranger to this university. This is the fifth time that he's visited the university, and he'll be coming back to us next February. With that, I'm going to hand the floor over to Dr. David Pomfret to introduce Professor Gilman. David.
Good evening. As convener of the Humanities Area of Inquiry of the Common Core Curriculum, I'm really delighted to welcome you to this, the inaugural Distinguished Lecture of the Common Core Distinguished Lecture Series. It's truly an honor to be able to introduce tonight's speaker. Professor Sandra Gilman is Distinguished Professor of the Liberal Arts and Sciences and of Medicine and Professor of Psychiatry at Emory University. He's well known to many of us at the University of Hong Kong already. For those who do not know him, I'm afraid the time is far from sufficient for me to do justice here to Professor Gilman's extraordinary scholarship. That would take up all of the time at our disposal, and probably more besides. Professor Gilman has been sole author of some 40 books and editor or co-editor of another 40. He has played a pioneering role in the study of the history of science, psychoanalysis, Jewish studies, German studies, and literary history. And he has been recognized for the magnitude of his contributions to knowledge through a plethora of academic prizes. Some of his recent books include Making the Body Beautiful with Princeton, Fat, A Cultural History of Obesity with Polity, and Obesity, the Biography with Oxford in 2010, and all have been published to wide acclaim. And while one might certainly describe our speaker as a cultural and literary historian, I should mention that, in fact, his expertise is really quite remarkable for its range. Professor Gilman has himself been the very embodiment of interdisciplinarity in the numerous positions that he's held. So, for example, for 25 years, he held positions in both the humanities and medical faculties at Cornell University as Goldwin Smith Professor of Humane Studies. He was Henry R. Luce Distinguished Professor in the Liberal Arts in Human Biology at the University of Chicago. And he was a distinguished professor of the liberal arts and medicine and creator of the Humanities Laboratory at the University of Illinois. He's also held many prestigious visiting positions at top universities around the world. We're really fortunate that tonight's speaker has been able to visit us at a moment when the University of Hong Kong is attempting to grasp the opportunity presented by the most extensive curriculum reform in a generation to rethink the humanities. In launching the humanities area of the Common Core curriculum, the universities set out to provide all students entering the new curriculum with opportunities to grapple with issues of fundamental human importance through interdisciplinary engagements with humanities discourses. The hope is that the humanities in the Common Core might help students to make connections between their own lives and complex knowledge, and to enhance the qualities of reflection, imagination, empathy, judgment, and considered action as well. So these are really exciting times to be entering the undergraduate curriculum at this university, and I'm really glad to be able to invite our speaker, whose own work bridges beyond disciplinary boundaries, and in particular between the humanities and sciences, and who has been integrally involved in recent debates over the humanities, to share in our excitement at the launch of the humanities area, and to very generously share his expertise with us. I don't want to keep you waiting any longer. Please join me in welcoming our very first distinguished lecture in a Common Core Distinguished Lecture Series, speaking to the subject of why the humanities matter. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Sander Gilman.
First of all, I want to thank the administration of the Common Core, and specifically David Pomfret, for the invitation to come here to speak about the humanities, and the humanities in the broadest sense of that word. I too have been extraordinarily engaged with this new project here at Hong Kong University. Hong Kong University, as you well know, officially launched its new four-year curriculum, and its center are new core courses across the disciplines, including the widest range of the humanities. The key to all of these are the so-called big issues that the humanities can and indeed must address. But the intent of this new curriculum in the humanities, social sciences, and the sciences is that this curriculum might be seen as much in terms of a dynamic process, the formation of an identity of informed actors, as in terms of its formal structure or knowledge content. That struck me as central, but also problematic. What I want to do for about the next 40 minutes is to talk at you, and I hope with you, about what is both a contemporary American problem about the humanities. But I hope, in the course of describing this problem, also point out to you why, in complicated ways, what you all are experiencing as students in this new Common Core may be a real answer to what is seen, certainly in the United States, as the problem of the humanities. And my first spokesman brings us a voice from beyond the grave. Whoops, now we don't have a sound. I love technology when it doesn't work.
In Apple's DNA, that technology alone is not enough. That it's technology married with liberal arts, married with the humanities, that yields us the result that makes our hearts sing.
Steve Jobs talks about making our hearts sing in the merger between technology and the humanities. This was a real theme for him. When he thinks about Apple, when he thinks about the world of contemporary technology, he thinks about it always at this intersection between the liberal arts and technology itself. In an interview in 1996, he noted that I think our major contribution to computing was in bringing a liberal arts point of view to the use of computers. If you really look at the ease of use of the Macintosh, the driving motivation behind that was to bring not only ease of use to people, so that many, many more people could use computers for non-traditional things at that time, but it was to bring beautiful fonts and typography to people. It was to bring graphics to people, so they could see beautiful photographs or pictures or artwork to help them communicate. Our goal was to bring a liberal arts perspective and a liberal arts audience to what had traditionally been a very geeky technology and a very geeky audience. Now, I've got to admit, I was part of that completely non-geeky audience when I got a 128K Mac with no ability to record anything except on a tape recorder that was connected to the Macintosh. But it was so cool. It was a great toy. But it also began to change the way that I saw not only writing, but thinking. Now, I had no idea that Jobs and the people at Apple had aimed their new computer at me. But all of you, in a sense, grew up in that world. The humanities then were part of that way of thinking about a new technology. So that's the first way of thinking about technology. It's the first way about thinking about the humanities. There are negative voices. We are in, and none of you can ignore this, a time of great economic stress. And sadly, I suspect this worldwide economic stress will probably continue past your own graduation. And there's a cynical voice now that looks at the humanities and says basically, not let's do what makes our hearts sing, but let's do what allows us to get a job. In an article which caused a lot of furor last May in Forbes, Peter Cohen wrote that the humanities seem today to provide useless skills. And he noted that those who still want to study zoology, anthropology, philosophy, art, history, and humanities could read the books during their Starbucks barista work breaks. Now, that's cynical. Because unlike Jobs, what it says is that what we learn at university are skills for a specific job that we get and that we hold, and that's what defines us. But all of you are not going to have one career. And I don't mean one job. All of you are going to have more than one career. You're going to have 2 careers or 3 careers. You're going to do things in 10 years that the skills that you learn now may not be appropriate for. But remember what Jobs said about making our hearts sing. One of the things that he's talking about is the fact that the humanities, and I'm going to make a pitch that everything taught at the university is not merely skill sets, learning to do stuff that is marketable, but more importantly, it is learning to learn. And Jobs, though he certainly never invented the computer that we now know, he did invent a kind of philosophy of the computer as that site of the intersection between technology and humanities. And we live in a world in which that intersection is now broadened. It is an intersection now in which the computer becomes maybe also a space which is the new university in a new global world. Marshall McLuhan in the 1960s said it already. He said that the medium is the message, that technology is what we should be looking at. But Jobs said that it's not just the medium, but what the medium, in a sense, brings us to be able to do. And it is this new university that you inhabit. It is this new university that the new humanities inhabit.
This is me being inspired by my first tutor, my mom. And this is me teaching Introduction to Artificial Intelligence to 200 students at Stanford University. Now, the students and I enjoyed the class, but it occurred to me that while the subject matter of the class is advanced and modern, the teaching technology isn't. In fact, I use basically the same technology as this 14th century classroom. Note, the textbook, the sage on the stage, and the sleeping guy in the back. Just like today. So my co-teacher, Sebastian Front, and I thought there must be a better way. We challenged ourselves to create an online class that would be equal or better in quality to our Stanford class, but to bring it to anyone in the world for free. We announced the class on July 29th, and within 2 weeks, 50,000 people had signed up for it.
And the idea of this new classroom is that space in which what we now call the digital humanities is also taught. Now, computation plus the humanities expands the classroom. But as Kathy Davidson at Duke notes, it also provides new ways of imagining what the humanities are in that classroom. Any survey of employers, and here perhaps an answer to Peter Cohen, ranks reading and writing as the skills most coveted and most often lacking in new employees. Other missing skills include collaborative abilities, abilities to translate complex and incommensurate information into conclusions, critical thinking, persuasive skills, and project management skills, plus global awareness and an understanding of culture and context for facilitating interactions in distributed, globalized workplaces. Sounds pretty soft, as scientists like to say. Sounds pretty humanistic. But she goes on to say that to reimagine a global humanism with relevance to the contemporary world means understanding, using, and contributing to new computational tools and methods. There are many fascinating examples of digital humanities projects that use newly digitized resources to change our often Eurocentric ideas of human interactions and contributions. So not only is the technology itself shaped by ideas and forces, but also it can be used in this new universal classroom to produce new kinds of knowledge. Now, I'm not terribly happy with Kathy Davidson's description of these as skill sets. I think everything that she talks about are the basic tools we learn when we learn how to learn. And certainly in our new digital age, an age which literally opens us up to the entire world. And I don't mean that as metaphor. I mean that you as individuals will work in a global environment and live in a global environment. It is just as easy for a viewer to watch me now from Kathmandu as here in Hong Kong. And by the way, write me nasty emails afterwards about what I've said. But this is a kind of applied humanities, a humanities that uses tools, informed tools, and opens up new horizons through their interaction. Certainly the smartest, I was going to say best, but the smartest literary critic writing today is Stanley Fish. Stanley is a curmudgeon. He's a professional curmudgeon. He loves to irritate people. And when he hears skills and skill sets, he says, does the humanities really want to change the world? And he answers in the New York Times, the pertinent question is, do humanities courses change lives and start movements? Does one teach with that purpose? And if one did, could it be realized? If the answers to these questions are, as I contend, no, one teaches the subject matter, and any delayed effect of what happens in a classroom is contingent and cannot be aimed at, then the root of external justification of the humanities, the notion somehow that the humanities make us smarter and better and give us more skill sets, of a justification that depends on the calculation of measurable results, is closed down. And maybe that's why I disagree with Kathy Davidson's use of the term skills. Because what Stanley is talking about is that process of learning to learn that the humanities, and indeed every subject in the university, demands of us. And he goes on to say something that sounds an awful lot like Steve Jobs. The effect of the art historian Bar Shapiro had on students as he spoke about Cézanne, they would say, whatever he's smoking, I'll have some. I recall the Renaissance scholar Jackson Cope telling me the story of how, just out of the Navy, a street kid from Chicago, he wandered into a class on iconography and emblems taught by the great Don Cameron Allen at the University of Illinois. I didn't know what he was talking about, Cope said, but he added, I did know I wanted some of that. That's what makes our hearts sing. So maybe the technology, maybe the digitization, maybe the skill sets all boil down to you as a student being confronted by someone, a teacher, who is so engaged in that process of learning that he turns you on not to the objects, but most importantly, most vitally, to that excitement that makes our hearts sing. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, answered Stanley in a letter to the New York Times, and noting that in the real world, by the way, I've never actually found the real world. If somebody actually finds it, point it out to me. In the real world, the distinction between the lack of value in the humanities and the greater value of the sciences on the basis of utility does not hold, because the philosophers have made important contribution to the sciences, for example, Merleau-Ponty and neurocognition, Wittgenstein and mathematics, etc. And the hard sciences have had a profound impact on the humanities. Eliot, Van Gogh, and Weber leap to mind. But this too is superficial. The notion, for example, that there is bleed between the humanities and the science still assumes that there's some kind of a wall between them. And what I want to argue today is there is no wall. What we learn in the classroom is we learn how to learn. Now there is, on the other side of Jeffrey Sachs, a kind of claim that the humanities has it all. In a recent book, and a very good book, by the way, my friend Andrew Del Bacco at Columbia University writes that the questions we face under the shadow of death are not new, and no new technology will help us answer them. So much for Steve Jobs. Science's principle of progress does not translate well into other areas of human life. Science tells us nothing about how to shape a life or how to face death. It not only fails to answer such questions, it cannot answer them. Debanco knows that some scientists have predicted that in time, neuroscience will define and ensure happiness, and biochemistry will distinguish truth from falsity among what today are mere opinions about sex and gender. But Debanco doubts that it will happen. Even if it does, none of us will be around, and it's not clear that we would want to be. This is, by the way, just as cynical as dismissing the humanities as something you should do in your spare time when you're earning minimum wage working at Starbucks. It claims something unique for the humanities. And it creates a caricature, by the way, of science and the scientist, which no scientist recognizes when he sees it. Now, I want to be personal for a moment, because I was asked to actually also talk about what I do. And what I would like to do is to talk just for a moment about the medical humanities as yet one more way of imagining, what the humanities are in the 21st century. Now, the medical humanities does not see itself either as ancillary to another field, nor as the humanities in and of itself. The medical humanities starts with an idea that there is medicine, that medicine is more and more defined in terms of its scientific claims. And those scientific claims are based on evidence-based medicine and practice that grows out of it. Now, this is a concept which is fairly recently coined at McMaster University. And what it did was to look for specific scientific basis for making medical decisions. Now, this is serious and it's real. But the medical humanities has, in a sense, a role to play in helping us understand the science of evidence-based medicine. And I want to give you two examples. The medical humanities is itself not a discipline. It may evolve in that direction, but what it is right now is a series of disciplinary approaches, from art history to literary criticism, to history to anthropology, looking at a sort of Venn diagram of overlapping objects from professional medical identity to illness to health, to hospital design to disability, all of which, of course, are part and parcel both of the practice of medicine from the standpoint of the medical practitioner, but all of you are part of that practice of medicine, because all of you will be either on one side or the other, or on both sides. None of us can avoid that. What's interesting to me is how these disciplinary approaches to such objects, when juxtaposed, present a deeper understanding of the clinical and research agendas of the health sciences, as well as for the humanities. In other words, it's not a corrective of, but another way of seeing these interlocked ideas and images. So let me start with the core curriculum. Humanities, Journey into Madness, Conceptions of Mental Health and Mental Illness. I've chosen two classes in which, as David was kind enough to point out, I've written things that are appropriate. So I want to talk about what I see as the sort of thing that gets addressed in such a class when one starts to think about the humanities. Now, mental illness is complex. It clearly has a bio-psycho-social dimension. It is both of the body, of the mind, of society. In the 1980s, I wrote a book called Seeing the Insane. What I wanted to do with that book is to ask, How, from the Middle Ages to the present, does Western society visualize, imagine madness, not as an abstraction, but as something concrete? From William Hogarth in the 18th century, having Tom Rakewell, the innocent young man from the country who comes to the big, bad city, could be Hong Kong, happens to be London, and is seduced by women and booze and gambling. Okay, Macau, not Hong Kong. And ends up in the asylum, ends up mad. But the asylum for Hogarth is a moral lesson. It is the macrocosm of the world. It is all of our madnesses. It is what happens to us when we derail from society. By the time we get to Milos Forman's film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975, the asylum becomes the place that society puts people who are saner than Nurse Ratched. It isn't a place that you descend into, nor is it a place that you can escape from. It is a place that controls. Also a moral lesson, but a moral lesson of the mid-20th century, not of the English Enlightenment. In Paris in the 1880s, Jean-Martin Charcot was convinced that he knew his patients by looking at them. He could diagnose by looking at their madness. And he had quite a famous student, a young Viennese physician who came to Charcot to study this way of looking. And he goes back to Vienna and he decides that Charcot is merely, as he writes after Charcot's death in 1893, a visual, a person who looks. And Sigmund Freud starts to listen and listens and treats through listening. And he's dismissive of looking exactly at the moment when we start to look in a very different way. So looking may have different meanings too within medicine and science. And we look at an X-ray and we see the bones of the hand, but we don't see the psyche. But we look at an fMRI now and we imagine we see the psyche, the mind disranged. But do we? Now, those are questions that the humanities ask, that the medical humanities ask, as part of an understanding that medicine wrestles with mental illness, that medicine is part of society that wrestles with mental illness, and that the moral values inside and outside of medicine determine the way that we see and that we treat the mentally ill. This doesn't mean that pills are bad, and it doesn't mean that we should doubt the existence of mental illnesses. What it says is that as practitioners, as patients, we are in our time. And it is the humanities that enables us in complicated ways to understand ourselves in our own time. Recently, I got interested in what this course calls the surveillance society. I got interested in looking at how societies, again, look at us. And I began to work on a topic which has become extremely important in our surveillance society, and that is body shape and body size, a weighty topic. Bad puns work in no language. Now, we are, if you believe the World Health Organization, in the middle of a pandemic of globosity. Terrible word. Globosity, global obesity. And it's a real interesting question, because I don't doubt, by the way, that the world is getting heavier because of us being on it, as each of us get heavier and heavier. But I got interested in whether or not this new global obesity was a disease itself, or whether it was a symptom of underlying physiological, psychological illnesses, or a sign of social excess, or maybe not even a disease in medical senses at all. And asked in my work whether or not this is maybe not even new. It is not a problem of the 20th century, but maybe a problem which has always haunted the way that we imagine what being healthy is all about. And I looked at some of the explanations. Now, one of the explanations for obesity, especially, by the way, among the little emperors, some of them are in this room, is the shift in a quality of life and life expectancy. We live longer, we have less physically stressful occupations, and we have easier access to more food. In other words, we get heavier because it's easier to eat more, and we have to work physically less. Or, now, does the abundant access to poor food, not just food, but poor food, and the absence of structures to engage physical activity cause obesity? This is what we call the obesity of poverty argument. It is the argument that poverty is a contributing factor in one's becoming obese. Absolutely counterintuitive. Poor people are supposed to be skinny. No, they get fatter. This is usually summed up as the McDonald's made me do it argument. Okay? Or is obesity the result of an addiction to food? We lose control over food consumption through addictive behavior. Addiction is usually understood on the medical model of some type of genetic pathological predisposition in an individual group, rather than as a kind of weakness of will. We talk about alcoholism as an addiction, and you have a kind of a genetic predisposition. Would you have a predisposition then to obesity, or at least to overeating that leads to obesity? And then there's the argument, which has been actually quite foregrounded recently, which is that basically genetically we are pre-programmed as an evolutionary biological drive to accumulate body fat in order to prevent starvation in times of famine. This is the so-called OBGEN argument put forth in 1994. And it's an argument, one of the early arguments, by the way, about looking at the genetic code, and looking at the genetic code in mice, especially bred mice. And then at the end of this paper, in the last paragraph, it says, well, human beings are like mice because in this Neolithic prehistoric world, if you had lots of extra body fat, you survived the famines, and if you didn't, you didn't. And immediately I thought to myself, had I been a saber-toothed tiger in that age, I would have gone after the fat ones. So much for evolutionary arguments. But one of the things we have to understand when we look at the question of obesity, as we look at the question of mental illness through the lens of the humanities, is that I don't want to discount the costs, both personal and national, that overweight can accrue. But to understand that why now, in the 21st century, we have suddenly seen the moral panic which was associated with HIV and AIDS in the 1980s, obesity as a potentially global disease that is going to destroy us. The anxiety about epidemics such as obesity points out the danger which lies in a moral panic that defines those diseases we openly fear and those infected people we openly disdain. Fat people are the last people you could make jokes about today. Obesity is now the central danger to confront all aspects of life or all societies. And that's why it's seen as both a disease of poverty and of affluence, a disease built into our genes, but a disease of addiction. In other words, fat people are a danger. And they're a danger because they are what we fear we all can become. Now, that way of seeing obesity doesn't discount all the other arguments. They're all probably right in part. But it does say that the humanities says, why is it now that we're suddenly obsessed by it? And by the way, if you don't believe we're obsessed by it, pick up any daily newspaper in the United States, in the UK. Now, by the way, also on the mainland. This fascination with obesity as that unbelievable disease that will bring our medical systems to their knees. Now, I've shown you a lot of contradictions in the humanities. And in America, certainly, these are seen as the problems of the humanities. But I want to make an argument that this is not a problem, but rather a quality of the generation and transmission of all knowledge, of the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. That is, contradictory ways of understanding the humanities are simply ways that we generate, speak about, think about, and enact knowledge. And let me take an example from the philosophers Deleuze and Guattari. They talked about knowledge as rhizomes. And you know rhizomes because you know ginger. Rhizomes are these odd things, these stems of a plant underground. They send out roots and shoots from their nose. They're creeping rootstocks. They go in all kind of directions. And they're seemingly disorganized in their extraordinarily organized way. They go left and right simultaneously. They go up and down simultaneously. And yet they continue to grow and expand. And that's true of science as well as the humanities. And I want to give you an example. And the example is chemistry. Chemistry has its origins in alchemy. And alchemy is, in its essence, a theological and philosophical system. H.J. Shepard writes that alchemy is the art of liberating parts of the cosmos from temporal existence and achieving perfection, which for metals is gold, and for man, longevity, then immortality, and finally redemption. Material perfection was sought through the action of a preparation, philosopher's stones for metals, elixir of life for humans, while spiritual ennoblement resulted from some form of inner revelation or other enlightenment, such as gnosis. But it's also simultaneously, and not in any contradiction, the moment when we start to explore the material world. We discover that we can generate this extraordinary metal that moves by heating this red ore. And when we have this silvery moving metal, we can mix it with gold and we get something that is neither gold nor silvery. And so the alchemists deal with the material world, and they deal with the philosophy and theology that they see inherent in the material world. By the time we get to the beginning of modern science, suddenly the notion of that theology seems to be missing. Robert Boyle, who comes up with the equation for the characteristics of gaseous states, and of course Antoine Lavoisier, who developed the theory of the conservation of mass, and also is the first one to describe oxygen. They seem to be without theology, but of course with ideology, because they're interested now in this material world and the laws that govern it. And they assume that those laws are natural laws. And they uncover, their word, not mine, in nature, regulation. And at the same moment, Samuel Hahnemann comes up with this idea that if you take this substance, this material substance, and you turn it into medicine, and he has a theory, he says, like cures like. I take a medicine that's going to cause a fever, and I give it to a patient who has a fever. But I can't do it too powerfully. So he adds a little bit of this medicine to water, and more, until the homeopathic medicine that results has merely the memory of the atoms of the substance. And we would say, but of course that's a rhizome going in the wrong direction. That's bad medicine and bad science. But what Hahnemann discovers is that it works. And he discovers that if you believe a medicine works, it really does work. So suddenly the trajectory of chemistry becomes the trajectory of psychology. Odd. The body itself now suddenly becomes a chemical factory. Wöhler is able to synthesize urea. Payen and Büchner contribute the first demonstration of a complex biochemical process showing how alcohol fermentation and cell extracts of yeast work. The body is suddenly merely a chemical factory, like all other chemical factories. Biochemistry then suddenly becomes something that links two arenas, human biology and medicine and chemistry, but also with an ideology, the human being as machine. And by the time we get to the 20th century, that notion that starts with the alchemists has, in a sense, maybe its most extraordinary leap in the work of my old friend Tom Eisner and Jerry Meinwald. Tom was a field biologist. By the way, one of the most brilliant men I've ever known. And he was doing work among moths in northern Florida. And it turned out in the field that he was in, there were two kinds of moths which from his perspective as a scientist were indistinguishable one from the other. But it was also very clear to him that they could distinguish one from the other because the females and the males of one bred and the females and the males of the other bred. And they never got confused. And he tried to figure out what was going on. And so he took a jar of these moths back to Ithaca with him. And he thought very hard about them. And he said, I bet you that the female moths exude some kind of chemical that attracts only the moths of their species. And he went to his friend Jerry Meinwald, who was a chemist, and said, Jerry, look, I've got this jug of moths, and I'm pretty sure that what's happening is that the females are exuding something that the males are picking up. Can you figure out what's going on chemically? And Jerry, being a really, really good chemist, discovered that there were not two kinds of chemicals in the jug generated by the moths, but four. And suddenly Tom had an aha experience, the kind of experience that a great scientist and a great humanistically trained scientist has. And he said for him it was the beginning of knowledge. He said to me, I went into the field assuming that sexy lady moths seduce virile male moths. And it turns out that both the males and the females exude what Tom coined as pheromones. That is, everybody is communicating. And Tom and Jerry created the field that is called chemical ecology. And here, in an odd way, we come back to Steve Jobs. Because chemical ecology is not about chemistry, it's not about biology, and it's certainly not about moths. It's about information theory. These are rhizomes. They go in odd directions. They force us to rethink what knowledge is at every intersection. But we can never be sure. We can never be sure.